This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about villain development. How much do you need to know about your antagonist before you start writing? During that writing process, are you going to get stuck or mess up the plot if you don't have a, a three-dimensional antagonist at the beginning? What issues have you two come across when you're developing your stories and thinking about your antagonist?
Well, yeah, when I first started, I definitely had the moustached, caped villain, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to realise that they needed to be a little bit more three-dimensional, which was interesting actually, because it led in the third book in that particular series to a kind of an unexpected moment that was easily foreshadowed if you'd gone back to the other two books. I didn't plan it. I just thought, oh, that'd be a neat way to solve this problem, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it connected three characters together: a missing character, the villain, and the protagonist, in a scene that some of the readers thought was completely unpredictable, yet made total sense. So. And it gave me an opportunity to round out the villain and explain why they were the way they were, because they were a split character. So it was really, I do think, you know, the more you think about it, if it's the age-old story, isn't it? You know, make the villain the hero of their own story, and then you start to get the feel for, well, they've got their own goals, they've got their, you know, there must be a reason why they are trying to do what they're doing, which is so heinous.
Right.
Everybody's got a reason for doing everything. So, in neurolinguistic programming, you have one of these famous precepts, which is, you know, everything makes complete sense to everyone at the time that they're doing it. Even people who are doing awful things, you know, it makes sense. It's the only thing they could possibly do to get in or out of whatever it is they're trying to do. So I think, you know, if we do that, then that can work.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think one of the issues I see students and clients come up against is that they focus so much on the protagonist that they might not know where the story is going or what the climax is or what's going to be at stake unless or until they put some of that focus on the antagonist and realize, you know, decide what is motivating this antagonist, what does the antagonist really want, and then how is this all going to come together at the end. It's like if you don't have a sense of the shape of your climax, you don't know which direction to drive your journey. You know, like if I want to go on a road trip, I have to pick if I'm going to the East Coast or the West Coast before I can take step one.
Yeah, I think that was one of my problems for a while, was also just that kind of that middle section that gets a little bumpy, because you're like, the antagonist, he's there in the climax. So, like, that was it. That's all I knew, right? And so without that development, your middle becomes very slow, and you don't really know what your character's supposed to be doing, because you don't know what they're building toward, and you don't know why they're building toward it, or, you know, what they need in the end. And I found that I was leaving the antagonist kind of ignorant of the protagonist, of what they were doing, you know, so like it was just like, boom, protagonist ready, let's have a battle, you know, rather than really pitting them against each other from the beginning all the way through. And that really helped me to kind of like start developing, okay, like, what would this mean for them, and how's the antagonist going to start reacting? And then as soon as the antagonist is acting, it's easier to figure out what your protagonist needs to do to grow and to change and to move forward.
Yes, yeah, it needs to be an interplay between the protagonist and the antagonist throughout the entire story, not just at the end. Even if the antagonist isn't fully known to the protagonist through, the first half, for example, or through whatever portion of the book. And even in Act 1, you need to have a sense, the reader needs to have a sense of what the main conflict is. So even though the protagonist doesn't actually walk through that door and launch the main plot until the end of Act 1, the tension never changes. The main tension is present from the beginning. If you look at The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy doesn't meet the Wicked Witch of the West, has never heard of her until she lands in Oz. But the Wicked Witch of the West is mirrored in this gulch. And right away from the very opening of the movie, Dorothy is upset because Toto has been threatened by the mean lady in town. Well, the whole journey is about her need to protect her friends. She has to keep her friends safe. And so the source of conflict never changes from opening to closing, even though the true villain doesn't turn up until, she lands in Oz. Now, granted, in the tornado, Miss Gulch is on a bike and then on a broomstick. And so the mirror is obvious, but it's obvious, but it's a truism that applies to our stories, however subtle we want to make that source of tension at the beginning.
Yeah, because you've got to have those forces present throughout the story, or else it doesn't make sense. Because otherwise you've just got the protagonist kind of aimlessly moving around. When I say aimlessly, it might look like they've got aims, but it's not. There's no connection to whatever is advancing the story. I can remember when I very first read Robert McKee's book Story, and that I wasn't writing at that time. I was just really curious about humans and how we tell stories to propagate our cultures. And one of the interesting things that I picked up from the book quite early on was, that if a scene doesn't move the story forward, then it's not part of the overall story. And it was really eye-opening, because I know it sounds so stupidly dirty, and you think, oh yeah, of course, but then you start watching movies and you realise, well, hang on a minute, that scene did absolutely nothing. Why is it in there? It didn't move the story forward. It was a waste of time. I think Sean Coyne calls them shoe leather. This sort of idea that nothing happens, yet something is seeming to happen. And I think that's because we're not experiencing the forces of antagonism, whether it be directly, whether it be indirectly, whether it be just a presence. I really liked, there's a more mechanical way of thinking about it with, I think it's Larry Brooks in Story Engineering, where he introduces the concept of pinch points in between your major plot turning points, and the pinch point belongs to the villain, where it's a reminder to the reader of the power that the antagonist or the antagonist forces hold over the protagonist. Because so many authors get stuck in that big middle part where, we say, well, the middle part or Act 2 belongs to the villain because theoretically everything the protagonist does shouldn't really work, or it might feel like it works, but it isn't really. So they're up against it, and they can't solve it till the end of the story. How do you illustrate that? How do you bring that forward? A lot of people struggle with that, and I like the idea that pinch points could give you a little thing to hook on it. You shouldn't get stuck on it. You shouldn't say, at 37.5% through the story, I've got to have the villain magically appear. But it's a nice way to think about it rather than conceptually of, well, I've got to have these forces bearing down on the protagonist. So how does it make an appearance, or how do they make an appearance? So I think it's important.
Well, and how are you going to work on your character's motivation or their stakes if you don't know what they're up against and what it's going to cost them and what they need to be doing? I think it's so easy to just okay, I'm just going to craft this character that I love and I'm just going to start throwing stuff at them. But if you actually, take the time to sit down and develop your antagonist, force, person, people, multiple people, however it manifests in your story, then you have a much better foundation for creating your protagonist's motivation and what's at stake and And I think then it starts to be a little bit more clear, the path through. And it's really hard to do it backtracking.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're talking about, developing your antagonist at the beginning is so helpful, because otherwise you start like creating this character who maybe doesn't really work as well as maybe you were hoping they would, and the story's just not working right, and why is this character not doing what they need to be doing, and I'm forcing them through, and it's because we haven't taken a look at the antagonist first and how that character needs to interact with it.
Right. And I think we should refer people back to our recent episode on Velcro, on keeping your protagonist and antagonist sticky, and if you just create a villain to be a foil for your hero, then you aren't going to have the Velcro. You aren't going to have the kind of development and motivation that you need to keep that escalation working, to keep it, plausible within the game of your story, and to keep pulling your protagonist and therefore your reader forward through that plot. Right. If anything is there because it's convenient for you to put it there, then get rid of it. Go back and develop more.
So maybe how would you approach developing the antagonist at the beginning of your story? Like, do you start with your protagonist? Do you start with your antagonist? Like, how do you approach that?
Mm-hmm. I don't have a formula for it, or it's always this way and then it's always that way, because so much of my development happens through the journaling process, through the pre-writing stage. And so I write out my discovery as I go, and often it's in the form of notes. A note sparks a note, but then that might give me an idea for a scene, and I might kind of pre-write a scene, do some discovery drafting, or I might just sketch the scene in my journal so that it's there for me to come back to later. But I don't start my true first draft until I have a sense of the story's arc, and it makes sense how these characters work together. What does our protagonist need to do or stop the villain from doing, and vice versa, and why? Right. And sometimes the Velcro isn't a direct A to B, like in the Murder in Skog Hall. Jess buys a house that's haunted by a woman who was murdered there 40 years ago. So Jess needs to save her house, right? She needs to put this ghost to rest so she can keep living in her house. But to do that, she has to solve this murder. And because it's a ghost story, the climax ends up being paranormal. So at the beginning, I might not have known exactly what my climax was going to look like, but I knew it's Jess versus the guy who murdered her ghost. It's, a 40-year-old crime, so this is going to be a paranormal conflict, not a true physical person-to-person conflict. I know it's going to be set at the haunted house. I know it's got to be super creepy, tons of mood because it's a ghost story. And I know the stakes have to be life or death, that Jess could actually, die as a result of experiencing the murder that happened 40 years ago, but with her in place of the actual victim. And that's a lot, a lot of detail without actually writing the scene, without knowing exactly what it looks like. That gives me the parameters of it. So then Jess and the killer, the Velcro is that as the paranormal activity increases through Jess's getting closer and closer to solving this murder, she does take the place of the victim. So then his reason for killing the victim kind of becomes the reason for Jess's life being at stake. It sounds a little convoluted and complex, but it makes sense in the story when you walk through it, right? But it doesn't, saying you need Velcro and you need to know the motivation of each character, it's not limiting. It's like Robert has said, when you create these rules for yourselves, these parameters, it actually opens up your creativity because you have a problem to solve.
Right.
How do I get Jess and this guy into direct conflict in my climax when, he's dead.
Right.
Right.
But your antagonist also is wrapped up in the house, it's wrapped up in the ghost, it's wrapped up in like all of these things, right? And the main conflict doesn't just have that one antagonist, the killer, developed, right?
Right.
And I think that's something where if you're developing your antagonist, it's so easy to focus on the antagonist, the person, right? You could have just said there's a killer, like blah. But for Jess initially, the antagonist is her house. Her own house is against her. And I think that then you are going into setting development that includes the antagonist, and then you're going into theme development that includes the antagonist, and all of these things. So it's easy to kind of like segment the antagonist and say, I need to work on my antagonist, but really it's not that simple.
Right. You're right. That's such a great point, Kathryn. You have to have a much more holistic view, because even the ghost who's the murder victim is the antagonist for a while until Jess understands it. It's like the setting, the victim, and then eventually the killer. And of course she does have to do that work of being a detective and solving a mystery. She's got to travel up and down the river road to talk to people who knew the victim and do her digging and all that stuff. And still, you have to keep the escalation going, even when you're getting from A to B, when you're getting your, the information in front of your hero and therefore your reader. And so each step of the way, each dot that you're trying to connect has to also effectively escalate the story. Increasing that Velcro, that stickiness. If you're listening to this podcast, you are probably a writer, and you've maybe heard me talk about the StoryWorks reading series. It is the new branch in the StoryWorks family tree. It is a literary journal podcast. That's right, a hybrid, a literary journal for your ears, with a print anthology at the end of the year of the best of the podcast. I am open for submissions, and I want to see your best prose right now. I am taking both fiction and creative nonfiction. You can read the guidelines and submit your work at storyworkspodcast.com/submit. What are you waiting for? It's time to see your stories published and sit on the other side of this microphone from me. Have a conversation about your storycraft.
Yeah, I think the Velcro idea is a really good way to think about it, because if what's putting your protagonist back to the antagonist every time enables them to make hook another thing or unhook another thing, whatever you like to however you like to use the metaphor. I think some of the great stories that I've read is where the protagonist learns more and more about the antagonist as they go through. It's not just some bland force that they have to outwit, but they have to find ways, and that's where we get the middle part of the story being fascinating, because some of the things they do just don't work or backfire or make things worse. And then in the really masterful ones, you feel that the antagonist also learning about the protagonist, even if they don't know them, and finding ways to trap them, like Star Wars, for example. And so and really personifying the entire conflict down to just two people in a room, for example. Even though it's about dark versus light. So I really like that the Velcro idea can give you the idea that there's not just one thing smashing them together. There's lots of little hooks. And those hooks may be pulled apart and come together again, or pull apart and come back together in a different setting, in a different fashion. Because to me, that those little tidbits where the protagonist gradually uncovers what the antagonist is about, and maybe things dawn on them, and they understand that. And sometimes they can even understand why the antagonist is doing what they're doing, but they still got to stop them.
Right. Yeah, that's such a great point, Robert. In Skog Hall, the killer is actually the victim's high school sweetheart, but he went away to Vietnam and he came back with horrible PTSD, but it wasn't called that then. And so he actually killed her in the midst of a traumatic flashback. He never would have killed her if he had been himself. And so then he's the villain, but is he really to blame? You know, there are these other forces at play that are much bigger than any of the individual characters. And as, you know, you were talking about those hooks, Robert, it reminded me that when Jess is doing the legwork and going through Act 2 and discovering more about the people who came before her, what she discovers is that the victim's husband wound up being put away for the crime. You know, it's a small town. Nobody wants to believe it can happen there. So quick, it was an election year, get somebody, throw him in jail and forget about it. Everybody sleeps easy. So once she knows that and she discovers he's not the real killer, now the stakes aren't just her house. It's not just her personal life and property. There's a man who didn't get to see his son grow up because he was in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And, you know, so then we get the emotional stakes of reuniting a father and son and such, and righting a wrong. And so part of the escalation of that stickiness between your protagonist and antagonist, it isn't just physical danger or what stands to be gained or lost. It's also, you know, to go back to what Kathryn was saying, that holistic sense of the big picture, the story, and pulling in your subplot threads, weaving them into your main plot.
And if you can do that with the flaw that the protagonist has as well, so you know, the villain directly connects into that, so it means that their own journey of discovery of the villain also reveals things about themselves that are flawed, or an old wound, or you know, a blind spot. Then we start to get some real beautiful layering in that. And some of that doesn't necessarily always happen. You know, if you're outlining or first drafting, it might be that you make a realization as you draft. Oh, I could spice this up by having this as an issue ongoing.
I love how we always start these conversations like, let's talk about developing your villain, and in reality we're talking about developing your entire story. Because the villain touches so much, right? Because they are that, you know, the center point of your plot conflict, and they're the reason why your character is developing so that they can enter the plot conflict, and like all of these things. Something that I was struck by as you were talking about like that Velcro idea, is like that villain has been there before the story started. And I think sometimes it's easy to, you know, put the villain as showing up at the end of Act 1. Here they are, ta-da! Like they appeared out of thin air. Everything was fine. But like Jess's house was haunted before page 1. And like, you know, some other stories where like the villain could be cancer, right? Person had cancer before page 1, you know, but they're only now entering the fight, or, you know, something like that. That sort of an idea that, you know, welcome to Lord of the Rings again, you know, he's been there since before page 1. All of these villains have been a constant, and that's something that changes, that brings a protagonist in, right? So I think thinking about developing that villain as part of your world building, like this has been something that is ongoing, you know, what has changed, what has brought the protagonist into this fight is a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that is. I love that. That's profound. No, that's so cool because, well, you're right. You know, we think of our story, okay, we're going to open the story with this protagonist and everything goes forward from there. But just as the world has been there before, so have the lives of all of the other characters in the story. You know, we develop our protagonist's backstory and history. And depending on how close to the top of the pyramid other characters are, the more we know about them. But I think it can be easy for writers to forget about the antagonist as having backstory, as having history, as having the same degree of motivation that the protagonist has. It just happens to be opposing, at least with, you know, human villains, cancer motivation. I don't know, right? But
right. And then you get to do the fun stuff like continuing with the murder and Scott Hall stuff, like, why Jess? Why now? Why is it and then you get that as you're pre-writing, as you're spiraling off, like that can spawn a lot of things. So.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that you get an idea for a story, and sometimes that can be a scene or a character, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to, at that very moment, start to think about what is, the villain's backstory, the antagonist's backstory here, just because it would drive unconscious planning from there on. If you thought more about that, because you're quite right, Kathryn. I mean, nothing exists without it anyway, and they didn't just spring into existence because the pen touched the paper or the keyboard started. They were already there. So I really like that idea. If I think about it, that's what I've had to do for the second book in this particular series, where I've had to really think through why the ominous threat is getting more ominous and where it's coming from and how it's being driven by factions within a very large force, and give it some believability, because otherwise book one was just a fascinating battle for no reason, but now that battle's taken onto a bigger playing field.
Right.
Yeah, and we always go back to Harry Potter. I mean, Voldemort is the major force of antagonism throughout the entire series, but he's personified in particular villains or particular conflicts within each, and it's not really until you get to the last couple of books where we get down to the crux of the matter.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, just thinking about the villain's backstory, back in high school and college, I was very involved with Amnesty International, and there was a movie that came out that they did, or someone did, I don't know. But anyway, I saw a thing, and it was about the way torturers are made, not born. The way some guy enters, the military or the government and is chosen, is targeted, and then is very carefully desensitized little bit by little bit and trained and put under pressure, and all of these, this very lengthy, careful progression to get somebody to commit those acts against other human beings. And so when we start writing stories where something awful has to happen and we have a human character who's perpetrating that awful thing, I think it's smart to ask ourselves why. How did this person get there? I mean, maybe it's a character who was just born a total psychopath or sociopath, but not necessarily, right? And understanding that. Go ahead, Kathryn.
I Am Not a Serial Killer by Dan Wells. This is a sociopath who's the protagonist, and it kind of forces you to rethink the idea of, oh, my villain's just a sociopath, right? Because that isn't the answer. They have to also have other mitigating factors, other things that have, brought them to a place where they are, like you said, willing to, and maybe even desirous of, creating chaos, wreaking havoc, ruining people's lives, all these things. Like what caused them to have that? Go back and read some biographies of, terrible people.
For a little lighthearted bedtime reading.
A little lighthearted reading for everybody. But, if you know some history, you can kind of start seeing some things that are consistent, or things that happen that cause people to act in certain ways, or, to react in certain ways. And not all people and not all circumstances are going to match up with that. So, yeah, that's really good.
Right. And not everybody who does these horrible things was born a psychopath. That's not always the situation. So that's something else to consider too, to avoid just falling back on something that might seem obvious or might seem easy or even most plausible. If you can find a different angle or a different reason for this, that might be more interesting, more exciting, and then ultimately more believable, because you have done something to build it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like the Bourne Identity, where there's the entire premise is that he wakes up and doesn't know who he is, and then gradually discovers he's been forged into being this unemotional programmed killer, and there's an entire conspiracy and program behind it. So typical Ludlam, but still the premise is exploring what turned him into this kind of person, even if it was a very deliberate, maybe drug induced or hypnotic therapy or whatever it is, but something made him that way.
Final thoughts on developing villains?
Take off their moustaches and their capes and make them real.
No, that's right. Spend the time.
Are you ready to take your storycraft to the next level? StoryWorks Fiction Online School has courses available right now, from micro courses on character traits to master level workshops on plot and building characters. There are also live workshops with your instructor in the classroom with you every week, guiding your progress and workshopping your manuscripts along the way. All students enrolled in StoryWorks Fiction, whether active in a class or not, can take advantage of the monthly free live Q&A calls with Alida. Check out storyworksfiction.com today and take your storycraft to the next level. Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.